In this episode, what I want to talk about are JavaScript events. JavaScript events can be a little bit hard to explain, so let's kind of put together a make-believe example, and I think that'll probably take us through it and help make it clear exactly what these things are and how they work. Now, we know from previous experience that in HTML there is a type of input tag that we can put in called a button. This is, of course, just an example. Events are going to work with lots of things other than these buttons, but this is a very simple, straightforward way that we can kind of go about getting directly to events. So here I have the HTML input tag type button. Value says click me, so it basically gives me a button that says click me on it. You might have wondered even previously in HTML why in the world this tag even exists, because in HTML it seems to have no effect whatsoever, in that it just gives you a button that can be clicked, but there's never any kind of response in HTML or CSS to the clicking of that button. Well, something we've learned now, just in the previous episode, is that not only do we of course see the visual representation of the button on the rendered page, but we also know that behind the scenes, JavaScript has taken that HTML tag and turned it into a JavaScript object, which exists inside the document object model. We know that this object comes from the input tag, and all of the attributes of the input tag become attributes of the object. So just like the tag, the object has a type attribute that's set to button and a value attribute that's set to click me. But here's where things then get interesting. What we haven't talked about previously is that not only are those two attributes a part of that object, but there's actually a collection of other attributes that are also added to the object as well, based on what type of object it is. In this case, JavaScript actually recognizes an input tag of type button, and because of that, it adds a series of different what we would call events to that particular object. Now, the events themselves are really nothing but more attributes of the object, so we can work with them more or less the same way we could work with type or value or any other object attributes. All of the attributes themselves are usually pretty easy to recognize because they all start with the word on, O-N, and then they generally end with some type of action statement, like in this case, click, mouse over, mouse out. There are others besides these three, but these are three that are used very commonly, so you'll run into them quite a bit. How we actually work with these different events, these special attributes that have been added to this object for us by JavaScript, is that we can actually create a function. We can then take that function and assign it to one or more of the different events that are present inside that object. The way this is then going to function is that these events are special and a little bit different than other attributes in that they are associated specifically with particular types of occurrences, what we would generally call triggers, that can occur within the browser. Some of these triggers are user-generated, things that users actually do. Other triggers can be things that are actually brought about by the browser itself in different situations. So what will actually happen here is when we have a button and the button has an on-click event and we've put a function into that on-click event, whenever the user actually clicks on that button, JavaScript and the browser will know to go to the on-click attribute of that button's object, the object representing that button in the DOM, and to actually execute whatever function happens to be stored there. We can put as many functions or functions of whatever complexity as we might choose into these different events, and there's a few different techniques for how we can actually put the functions into the events in the first place. But this becomes a real interesting turning point in JavaScript. Previously, we had our HTML and we had our JavaScript, and rarely ever did the two of them interact very much. But at this point, and kind of from this point forward, the two of them become very much sort of an integrated whole, where the user's actions and the things that the user does on the HTML, on the actual rendered web page, can then trigger events in our JavaScript. This is also an interesting turning point in that previously all of our scripts always ran when the page was first rendered. What's going to happen here is that we are now going to be able to put functions into the events of different objects, and we're going to have those functions just sit there, basically dormant, until something occurs either from the user or from the browser itself that triggers those functions and has them actually execute at a time later than when the page first loads. Let's start off by taking a look at some of the different ways that we can actually assign JavaScript code to events. In order to be able to do this, we're first of all going to need some type of HTML tag that has events associated with it. So like we did in the previous discussion, let's create a HTML button. Okay, so I've used the input tag type button, and I've assigned it the value of click me. When we take a look at it in the browser, we can see here that my button is there, but when I click it, absolutely nothing in the world happens. If I wanted to go ahead and have some JavaScript code execute in response to the fact that this thing has been clicked, what I could do is I could use the button's onClick event. What I actually am creating here is what's usually referred to as an event handler, basically some code that will execute in response to an event occurring. And maybe what I'll do here initially is I will just put an alert in here where I'll have it say clicked. All right? If I go back over to my browser, hit refresh, and then click my button, you can see that my alert pops up now in response to the button being clicked. So what's actually happening here is when the user clicks the button, that causes a trigger that the browser recognizes. The browser, seeing that the button has been clicked, goes to the code for that button, basically the object in the DOM, and checks to see if that button has an onClick event associated with it, or some code stored in its onClick event. In this case, it finds that in the onClick event for the button there is some JavaScript code, so what the browser does is it executes it. So the alert executes and the word clicked pops up in our alert. Works just fine, but you can imagine that if I had more than just a simple line or two, like my alert here, that I wanted to assign to the event for onClick for this button here, it would get awfully messy trying to put it all right here inside these quotes. You'll also notice something that's a little bit different here is that we've had we have some JavaScript code that actually isn't inside JavaScript tags, which is not something that we've run into before. Something that makes everything a little bit more normal and gives us a lot more flexibility in how complicated our event handling code can be would be, instead of having the JavaScript code here, to simply call a function here. Maybe I'll call it clicked, for example. And then what I can do is I could come up for maybe to my head section, put in a set of script tags, and then I could write the clicked function there. Something like that. If I look at that in my browser then, when I click the button, you can see that it still executes just fine. But in this particular case, since I've now taken the JavaScript code, I guess sort of the working part of the JavaScript code out of the HTML and instead put it up inside a function of its own, which is then called from the event, this now gives me a lot more leeway in how complicated I'm going to make that JavaScript code. Since it can all be up here inside the function, I could make that function as long as it might happen to need to be without having to worry about the complication of keeping it all typed down here inside this set of quotes. So that's one way that we sometimes end up assigning events to JavaScript code. But this way is still considered to be a little bit of a no-no in a way, because what it actually does is it still has, although a small bit, still has some JavaScript code that's actually in the HTML, which a lot of people tend to sort of disapprove of nowadays. Just like most people who build websites nowadays think that HTML should be about structure and CSS should be about presentation, with the two of them completely separate, everybody tends to agree that JavaScript should be essentially about behavior and should again not be directly inside the HTML or inside the CSS. Not that it could be inside CSS anyway. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there should be a nice clean separation between the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. And in this particular case, we still have some JavaScript that's down inside our HTML, which we don't really want. So as another way that we can actually do this, let me go ahead and create another button. It should be value. The text I'm going to put on this one is going to be button 2. Okay? And what I'm going to do about this one that's going to be a little bit different is I'm actually going to give this button an ID so that I'll be able to retrieve it using my getElementById method. I'm going to give it the ID of button 2. Right? What I could then do, actually this won't work at first, but I want to kind of build up to what we're actually going to do. But basically what the idea would be here, in order to keep the JavaScript entirely out of the body of my document, would be to essentially retrieve my button by doing document.getElementById and giving it the ID of my button, button 2, right? So that the button gets retrieved. Right? Then to button 2, I could then assign to its onClick event handler here, working with the JavaScript object itself instead of with the HTML tag, some new function, something along these lines. So I could maybe put an alert in here that says I'm button 2, exclamation point, because it really means it, right? So setting things up this way, it keeps me from having any JavaScript code in my body at all. Instead, all of the JavaScript code is here inside my script tags inside the head section. Or, of course, I could take that and put it in an external JavaScript file, which would have even better separation that way and would make it more reusable on more pages of a site without having to retype the code again. But like I mentioned before, this isn't actually going to work. If I come over to my browser and hit refresh, button 2 does indeed show up, but when I click button 2, nothing actually happens. If I come up and I look at my error console, what I'll find is that I'm getting an error saying the result of expression B2, which is null, is not an object, and that's happening on line 18, it tells me. If I take a look at line 18, that's actually the end of my function here, but what it's actually referring to is this entire statement. The problem is I am trying to assign onClick right here for something that is null. B2 is null. So you might wonder, why is B2 null? Didn't we retrieve it right here? Well, it kind of looks like we did, but unfortunately this statement wasn't actually successful, because when the browser actually loaded this page, right, it started at the top, worked its way down through it. It saw and recognized the click function. It then came and tried to get an element called button 2 that had the ID of button 2. But unfortunately, the thing called button 2 had not been created yet. At that point, the browser had only read from the top of the file down to about line 15 here. So it hasn't yet discovered that there is an element down here in the body that has an ID of button 2. So my document.writeLine here actually ends up returning null. Right? Null is what gets stored in my B2 variable, and then when I say assign to the onClick attribute of B2, that's when the error actually occurs. So while this is a better way to go about it, because it keeps the JavaScript out of the HTML in a better way, it does make it a little bit more complicated, because I can't, quite as simply as I've done here, just go and retrieve the element and stick a function into one of its attributes, into one of its events. What I would actually have to do if I wanted this to work correctly is I would have to make use of another event of another object. And the object that we want to deal with here is actually the window object. The window object has an event associated with it called onload. The onload event will actually execute whenever the document loads. So what I could do, for example, is I could say onload equals function. And then in here, maybe I'll put in an alert that says document loaded. There we are. And if I come back over to my browser and hit refresh, you can see that document loaded pops up. And it seems to do it immediately, but it's actually waiting until the browser has finished reading all the way through the HTML, basically until it's read all the way to the closing HTML tag. Once the browser has read all the way through it, at that point the browser itself goes back and triggers an onload event. So it goes back, looks for code stored in the onload event for the window, and executes it if it's there, which is why this alert then pops up. It seems to happen immediately, but there is actually the tiniest little delay that's occurring there as the browser is finishing loading the document. So where this window.onload event can really come in handy for me is, instead of popping up an alert there, if I instead take my code that's going to assign event to another component, in this case to my second button, and I put that inside onload, what will logically happen now, sort of in a timeline, okay, is that the browser will start reading my HTML file at the top, will read down through it, will see my clicked function but not actually act upon it. It will take this function, right, and load it into the onload event handler for window. Right? It'll then go through and read the rest of the document all the way down to the closing HTML tag. Once it's reached the closing HTML tag, at that point it goes back and triggers its own onload event and executes the function that we have stored there. So at that point it then does document.getElementById button 2. And at that point, since it's already read all the way through the document once, it knows that indeed there is an element called button 2. It retrieves it. Right? Once it's retrieved it, it will then assign this function to the onClick event handler for button 2 for my B2 object there, and everything should end up being rigged up the way that I want it. So if I come back and look at it in my browser now, and I click button 2, eureka, it works. This pattern is the one that we will see very, very frequently. As a matter of fact, from this point forward, probably the majority of the JavaScript code we are going to write is going to occur in this sort of setting, where we're going to have JavaScript code that's doing some preliminary work and setting up different events to go with different parts of the page. And of course, all of those things will have to happen inside a window.onload function so that they occur after the browser has read all the way through the document and knows what HTML is there to work with and what is not. In general, this technique of separating our JavaScript from our HTML is usually referred to as unobtrusive JavaScript, and it tends to be kind of considered, I guess, to be the best practice when writing JavaScript code nowadays. So since that's what all the experts say to do, that's what we'll actually do pretty much from this point forward in the class. It was easy for us, certainly, to be able to assign events to our different components using the onClick event or the onClick attribute in the HTML tag itself, whereas this way certainly does appear and I guess is a bit more complicated, but it is undeniably a better way to go. As another example of some of the things that we can do using our events, one of the things that JavaScript is very commonly used for is image rollovers. Basically, the ability to be able to roll your mouse pointer over an image or a link or anything and have it in some way change in reflection to the fact that the mouse has passed over it. So what I've done here is I've grabbed a couple of images. One is the image of a sun, the other is an image of a moon. They're just called sun.jpg and moon.jpg. And those are the two images that I'm actually going to use to do my image rollover. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off here in the body of my document by adding in an image tag where I'm going to have it put in the image of the sun by default. I'll put an alt tag in it that says sun. And I'm going to give this image an ID. What do I want to call it? Maybe I'll just call it I for image. Not very descriptive, but it's all I can come up with right now. How I'm going to now get this image rollover to work is up in the head section of my document, I'm going to put in a set of script tags. And like we were talking about just a minute ago, I'm going to set up a window.onload event where I'm going to create a new function that gets assigned to window.onload. So all of the code that's inside this function will not execute until after the browser has finished loading the document, until it's finished reading all of the HTML. So what I'll do in here is I'm going to start by actually getting the image by doing document.getElementById. Okay. In this particular case, I could have skipped the getElementById and just used the images array that's a part of the DOM instead, but this will work just fine and keeps things a little bit neater and cleaner, I think. So I prefer to go this way one way or the other. Right? What I'm then going to do is I'm going to take my object I, which should be that image tag, and I am going to work with its onMouseOver event. To its onMouseOver event, I'm going to assign a function, and what I'm going to want that function to do is to actually change the value of the source attribute of the image. So whenever the mouse pointer passes over the image, I want to change the image's source attribute. Essentially what I want to do is say source equals, and what I'm going to assign to it is going to be moon.jpg. I'm also going to want to change its alt attribute. I'll change its alt attribute so that it also says moon. The problem with what I have written here right now, though, is that the source attribute and the alt attribute are both a part of the image object itself. So I could potentially put I dot in front of each one of those, saying change the source attribute of the object stored in variable I, which should be the image that I retrieved here using getElementById. And let's take a look and see if that works. So there's my default image of the sun. When I put my mouse pointer over it, sure enough, it changes to the moon. Okay? One thing that can sometimes be a little bit problematic with this, though, is what happens if I for some reason change the value of the variable I somewhere between the time when I retrieve it here and assign this event to it and when the user's mouse pointer actually passes over it. That can sometimes be a kind of a trick to working with this, what we would call event-driven programming, in that things don't happen immediately. Instead, they wait for some event to occur before they actually execute. What I could maybe do instead is, instead of putting I in those two places, if I put in this, what should happen here is that this will actually refer to the object that this code is stored inside of, which is the object I, or basically the image object itself. And if we take a look at that over in the browser, when I mouse over, you can see it still works just fine. And this way should be a little bit more robust, since the code that's inside the event for on mouse over for my image is referring to the image sort of from an internal perspective, instead of trying to refer to it with its external name, which could come or go or disappear or change or have any one of a number of other problems. So this is a pretty good way for us to actually get that done. And again, mouse pointer over it, you see it changes to the moon. Now what if, when I take my mouse pointer over away from it, I want it to change back into the image of the sun again? Well, what I could do there is, already having the variable I with my image object inside it, I could work with its onMouseOut event, where I assign a new function to onMouseOut. And what I would essentially want to do in onMouseOut is just the same thing I did in onMouseOver, assign a value to the source and alt attribute of this, but here I'm going to go back to my original values of sun and sun. So I come back to my browser, I reload, mouse pointer goes over the image, it turns into the moon, mouse pointer comes away, turns back into the sun again. Right? So of course what's actually happening here is the browser goes through, reads the entire HTML file including my JavaScript. At the point it's done reading the HTML, it assigns all of my different functions. Well, at the time it's done reading the HTML, it goes back and it executes the onload function, which is all of this. Right? So when it executes that function, that's when it actually then retrieves the image and assigns some code to its onMouseOver and its onMouseOut event. Once that's occurred, the browser basically just kind of sits and waits. But as soon as I take my mouse pointer and move it over the image, like that, that triggers an event, right, where it goes back and it looks at the onMouseOver event for that image. And when it sees that there's a function here, it executes it. So when that function executes, the moon picture takes the sun's place and the alt attribute gets changed. Right? Whenever I have my mouse on it and I move my mouse away, again that triggers an event, the onMouseOut event in this particular case. So it goes and executes the function stored in that event and changes the source of the image tag back to sun and its alt attribute back to sun. Going a little bit further into how events in the browser actually interact with each other, let's take a look at a case of adding an on-click event to a link. What I actually have here on my page is I have just a regular old hyperlink that goes to Google. You can see if we take a look at it in the browser, it works just fine. I can click on it and off we go to Google. Okay. But let's say that, for example, on this particular page, I wanted to make sure that a user really wanted to go to Google before I actually let them leave, you might say. So more or less what I want to do is I want to use something like a JavaScript Confirm, where it'll say, are you sure you want to leave our wonderful website, before it actually lets them go to Google. So in order to do that, let me give this link an ID. I'm going to call it, I don't know, link 1, let's say. And then up in the head section, let me throw in some script tags. Like we've done in the last few examples, I'm going to put a function into the window.onload event, which is where I'm going to do most all the rest of my work. And the rest of that work is going to first of all consist of doing a document.getElementById to retrieve that link so that I can then do some work with it. Right? I retrieve the link and I'm actually putting it into a variable here called L1, which is again probably a very poor choice for a variable name since L's and 1's look so much alike, but L1 for link 1 was my thinking. Right? So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to do L1.onClick. I'm going to assign a new function to the onClick event handler for a link. Simply makes sense, I hope, that links have onClick event handlers, since what we mostly do with links is click on them. And let's say in here then what I want to do is I want to use JavaScript's confirm function to ask the user, are you sure you want to leave? Something like that. If you remember when we talked about the confirm function before, we know that what it's going to do is it will pop up a box, something like an alert, but that box will have an OK and a cancel button on it. If the user clicks the OK button, the confirm will return true. If they click cancel, it will return false. So let's go take a look and see how that works. Over in my browser, I hit refresh, I click my Google link, and we didn't immediately go to Google, but you can see it did indeed execute the event handler for clicking on this particular link. And this is my confirm box that's come up. And if I hit OK, off to Google we go. So everything seems fine at that point. But if I click on my link again, and this time I click cancel, you'll see that even though I clicked cancel, it still went ahead and took me to Google. What this has to do with is the fact that links have a built-in default on-click behavior. Of course, the default behavior of a link is that when you click on it, it takes you to whatever the href is for that particular link. Now, that default behavior is not replaced or overridden by our JavaScript when we put in some JavaScript for the on-click for the link, but I can actually have the two of them sort of work together. What will happen in this type of situation where there's a default behavior for an event is that if the JavaScript code returns a value of true, then that default behavior will go ahead and execute. Whereas if it returns a default behavior of false, it will not execute. Just to show you here, if we say, let's just do return false here from our JavaScript function that goes along with onClick. If I go back to my browser and I click the Google link now, it doesn't matter if I click OK or cancel because it will return false either way. And you can see in that case the default behavior is not executed. It doesn't follow that link. So instead of just returning false all the time, what I could do is I could tell my JavaScript to return whatever true or false value is returned by the confirm itself. So now, when the user clicks on the link, this function will get executed. Right? When the function executes, the confirm will pop up. If the user clicks OK, the confirm will return true. That true will then be returned using this return statement back to the browser, which will then tell it to go ahead and execute the default behavior for clicking on a link, basically follow the link. Whereas when this confirm pops up, if the user clicks clicks cancel, then the confirm will return false. That false value will then be returned again back to the browser, which will tell the browser do not execute the default behavior for clicking on a link. Basically, do not go to whatever URL was specified. So with that in there like it is now, if I come back and I hit refresh, if I click the link and I click cancel, we go nowhere. If I click the link and I click OK, off we go to Google. So here we have our JavaScript events interfacing, working along with the default events that are actually built into the browser, where our JavaScript can actually influence and kind of boss around a little bit what the browser typically will do with any particular tag if it has a default behavior. Well, I could do examples all day long of using events in JavaScript because they're so wonderfully useful. But let's just do one more example, maybe one that's a little bit more complicated before we move on and kind of work this into some other subjects that we still need to talk about. What I want to do in this particular example is what I usually call field prompts. Basically what the idea is that down in the body of my document I have a form that I've put in. Right now this form has a username field, a text field for the username, and a text field for the email address, and of course a submit button, like you pretty much always will have in a form. But what I'm doing with this form that's a little bit different than traditional is I'm not actually putting any kind of label or a prompt that goes along with the actual field itself. So when I look at the field in the browser, you can see that I have basically what appeared to the user to just be sort of two anonymous fields with no clue letting them know what it is that they're actually supposed to type in there. The way I actually want to handle this is what I want to do is I want to put the actual prompt telling the user what to put in a field actually inside the field itself. In essence, I want this field to say username in it, and I want this field to say email address in it. That's a pretty common thing. You see it around the web nowadays. It saves a lot of space and it's kind of clean and nice looking. The problem with it though is that whenever a user actually goes to fill out a field, if it's set up that way, is when they click on it, they first have to erase what's there and then they have to go and actually type in their actual username, which can be a little bit annoying for the user. But we could get around that little annoyance by using some JavaScript code to automatically get rid of those prompts inside the field for the user automatically whenever they come to a field. The way that we might do that is I'm going to want to assign some events to my fields, to my username field and my email field, and of course I'm going to put my JavaScript code inside some script tags in the head section of my document. All of this is going to need to happen after the document's already been loaded, so I'm going to add a function to my window.onload event. Right? And what I'm going to do in here first is I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it field, for example, and I'm going to do a document.getElementById to retrieve my, let's start off with the username field. So I'm going to retrieve the field called username, and you can see down in the body that not only have I set the name to the field to username, but I've also set that as its ID as well, so I can retrieve it that way. Once I actually have the field, I can then go ahead and set up some information for it. Like I could go ahead and put the default prompt into it. I could do something like field.value equals username. Capitalize that so it looks a little bit better. If I take a look at that in my browser then, right, whenever the form comes up, it automatically puts username into my field there for me. I could actually do the exact same thing down here in the HTML by using its value attribute, which would be a pretty good idea just in case somebody has JavaScript turned off. At least they will have some idea what that field is for, what it is that they're supposed to put there, even though if they have JavaScript turned off, they'll end up having to erase that themselves, but at least it will degrade well that way. Right? But one way or another, I can go ahead and put the value in using JavaScript here, which I'm going to go ahead and do. The other thing maybe I could do is, well, I guess the next thing I really want to do then is I want to set it up so that whenever a person goes to that field to actually fill in their own value, it gets rid of the value that I've already filled in there. So what I'm going to use is the field's event called onFocus. The onFocus event is one that's available for pretty much all your form controls, and what it will actually do is it will execute whenever the user clicks or otherwise reaches that particular field. Fields like text fields, for example, do actually have an on-click event, but onFocus tends to be better to use in case the user is going through the form by hitting the tab key instead of individually clicking on each field with the mouse. onFocus will always fire, will always trigger whenever the insertion point, whenever the cursor shows up in that particular field. So for the onFocus of this field, what I want to do is I'm going to put a function into it, and basically I'm going to say whenever this field gets focused, take this field and set its value to nothing, so it becomes empty. Let me go back over and take a look at that in my browser then. When I actually click on that field now, you can see that the value that was there before automatically goes away. If I reload the page and instead of clicking on the field I hit the tab key to go to it, you can see that that still counts as a focus on the field, and the prompt that I had there in that field again goes away, so the user can go ahead and just type in whatever they want. There is a little bit of a problem with that still though, in that if the user actually does type something into that field, right, moves on in the form, and then for whatever reason comes back to that field, the next time they focus the field, you can see it still performs that exact same behavior where it actually wipes out whatever was in there. That could be kind of bad if they hit the tab key one too many times, or if they're not filling a form out in the order that we originally intended. We could have them accidentally wiping out their own values and having to complete those fields multiple times, which users certainly wouldn't like. I could fix that here in the onFocus event for my field by putting in a little if statement where I could say if this field's value is, let's say, equal to the prompt that we put into it, so in this case username, then in that case blank the field out. But if the value of the field is anything but the username, anything but the prompt, don't blank it out. So if I go back and take a look at that in my browser then, when it says username in the field, if I click on it or hit tab key to get to it, it wipes it out. If I fill a value into it, Right? I fill it in, and when I come back to the field now, it does not erase that value because, of course, that value is not equal to my prompt, and the only time now my JavaScript is going to erase the value from that field is when it's the prompt that's actually showing there. So that works pretty well. Okay. The next thing I might want to do is actually deal with the kind of another side of the entire thing, which is what happens. I'm just reloading my form here. What happens if the user goes to the field, they focus it, so the prompt goes away, but they don't immediately fill the field out? What if they then at that point, maybe they stutter and hit the tab key 2 times, and they skip past the field and end up down here? Well, the way it works right now is when they leave the field without typing anything in, the field is simply left as being blank. So it would be up to the user then to remember what it was that they were supposed to type in there. But we could help them out with that too by putting in another event called onBlur for our field. OnBlur is sort of the difference, kind of the opposite of onFocus. Kind of makes sense. Focus and blur are opposite of one another's. Focus, of course, always triggers whenever the insertion point comes to that form control. Blur always triggers whenever the insertion point leaves that control. So what we could do here with onBlur is we could do something like, say, if this field's value is equal to blank, then in that case what we want to do is actually put the prompt back into the field again. So I'll say the value of this field will equal, and then my prompt again, something like that. So now with that field, if the user clicks on it and then leaves it, it puts the prompt right back in it again. If they click on it and type something in and leave it, whatever they typed in stays there. And if they come back and focus it again, the value that they typed in is still there. Of course, if they for whatever reason erase their value and then move on, the prompt then comes back. So that's a pretty usable little field there, so long as the user has their JavaScript enabled, which hopefully they do. It gives me a nice little way that I can actually put a form together. Now that still leaves my other field, the email address field, which we haven't done anything with at this point. And essentially what I want to do for it is all the exact same things that I've already done here for my username field. Except it would be an awful shame to have to go through and duplicate all this code again, especially if later I decide I want to change something about the way it works, or I find that there's an error in it that I haven't thought about, some bug, some logic problem that I haven't considered. Then I would have to go back and I would have to fix that problem or make that change in 2 different places. So I'd really like to keep this code as consolidated as I can, keep from repeating it as much as I can. So what I might actually do here is I think I might actually create another function. I'm going to call it field prompt. Right? And I'm going to set the field prompt function up so that it's going to be passed a field name, right, and a prompt. Right? So basically what I'll do then is I'm going to take all of this code that I've written here specifically for the username field, and I'm going to instead make it part of my field prompt function. And I'm just going to go through and make it a little bit more generic. Instead of having it be specifically for username, I'm going to, wherever I had username, put in field name instead. So whatever value I pass for field name, that will be the name of the actual element that gets retrieved and that we then go and do the rest of this work for. Right? Everywhere that I had my username prompt hard-coded in here, I'm just going to take the value of my prompt variable. So whatever value I pass in as the prompt variable will be the value that we actually fill into the field and occasionally in different situations replace and get rid of and do all of those wonderful sorts of things. Right? I can now get all of this set up again by calling my field prompt function from within the window.onload function. And here I'm going to tell it the field I want it to work with is my username field, and that the prompt that I want it to put into that field is the word username. So when this page is done loading and the browser executes the onload for window, it will call my field prompt function and pass it username for the field name and capital U username for the prompt. So username gets stored in the field name variable, username there gets stored in the prompt variable. So it will then go on and retrieve my username field, right? Set the initial prompt for it just in case it wasn't there somehow. Right? Set up its onFocus event where it checks for the appropriate prompt. Set up its onBlur event where it replaces the appropriate prompt, and hopefully that will all work. Let's go take a look and make sure everything's still working the way it should. I do have my initial prompt there inside my field, and when I focus it, the prompt goes away. If I leave the field without filling anything in, the prompt comes back. If I refocus the field, the prompt is gone again. If I fill in a value and leave, the value stays. If I come back and refocus the field, the value stays. If I erase the value and leave, the prompt comes back. So it looks like everything's working exactly the same way it did before, except now we've taken all of that functionality and put it into a function, which will make it a little bit easier for us to reuse. For example, what I could do here is for my email field, I could just call the field prompt function again, pass it the name of the field and the prompt that I want it to show, email address. And if I look at that again in my browser, my email address field is now set up to use all that same functionality. So I can type in my username, go to my email address field. If I leave it, it fills the prompt back in, and basically everything is still going to work the same way it did before. Okay. So that's pretty much that. That gets that set up very nice. There are a few other little usability things we could do in here. For example, we could use a little bit of CSS maybe on those fields so that the user might understand a little bit better that this isn't the actual value that's supposed to be in the field. Instead, it's just a hint there for them. I could maybe sort of dim out that text a little bit. For example, whenever I initially go to a field, I could set its style. Its CSS style property, I'm going to set its color to maybe a light gray, something like that. So my prompts initially come up a little bit sort of dimmed out. If I click on a field and type, it stays that dim color, which I don't really want. I want it to go back to black at that point. So maybe whenever I focus a field, what I could do is at that point I could take this field's style color and I could set it back to black. There we go. Let me reload my form in my browser. Okay, my initial prompt comes up kind of gray. If I click on the field and type, though, it now appears as black. Right? Is there anything we want to do with it on blur? Yeah, probably so. If I leave a field blank and I leave, you can see that black color remains. So if I blur a field, what I want to do is I actually want to, if I put the prompt back, also set the color back to that gray. So I'll do this .style.color back to the gray again. What did I do before? 888. There we go. All right, let's see how that works. So there's my default form. Right? I go to the username field, I type in a value. Right? I leave the field, it stays black, kind of showing it's been filled in. But if I skip over a field, the prompt comes back and the prompt stays gray. So everything looks good. I think that's pretty much all we need in order to get that example working pretty well. We will certainly work with events quite a bit more in future examples, but as far as examples just purely having to do with events, I think that should take care of us.